Hello, everybody. Welcome to Profiling Evil by Mike King. I'm here with my good friend, Chris McDonough. And today we're really looking forward to a discussion that we have with David Cawley of KSL Television in Salt Lake City, Utah. Chris, how are you?
Michael, doing great, 100%.
Good. Well, let's get right to work and bring David in and introduce him, folks. This is Dave Cawley from KSL. He is the executive producer of afternoon broadcasting. But David, you got a kind of a long history in journalism up until this point. Maybe you could take a minute and just help everyone understand your backstory, kind of where you grew up a little bit, talk about the University of Utah, because we got to take care of the Utes. And then your journalism career.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. So I work for KSL, as you mentioned. I've been with KSL for the better part of almost 9 years now. But I actually have worked in radio news going back all the way to 2003. I did attend the University of Utah. I went through their journalism school right around year 2000 timeframe. Always wanted to be in broadcasting. I loved listening to the radio when I was younger. Always kind of a news junkie. And so what better option than to get on the radio? I spent the first chunk of my career as a general reporter, doing some anchoring. I would go out and cover crime in the courts. And that is how I originally came across a story that I think most people now recognize me for, which is the Susan Powell case in 2009. After I moved over to KSL, I was producing their afternoon news show, and the Powell case went cold in 2013 after, and I'm sure we'll get into this, Josh Powell killed himself and his kids. And the West Valley City Police Department released a redacted version of their case file at that time. I started digging through that material, and ultimately that became a ridiculously long podcast that I put together called Cold that KSL released starting about almost 2 years ago exactly.
Yeah, and it's been actually wildly successful, hasn't it? There's so many people. You mention the podcast to any true crimer, and they know exactly which case it is.
And I mean, that's testament to Susan Powell, first of all, right? Her story is so incredibly compelling, and I think even from the first week of this case unfolding, people were just caught up in it. But what I was able to do, what KSL thankfully gave me the opportunity to do, was really tell her backstory and the backstory of this abusive relationship that she was in, all of the things that were happening behind the scenes in the investigation that I think in the public and even in the media for years and years suspected, but didn't really know.
That's really interesting. Chris and I have been spending a lot of time on domestic violence and domestic violence homicide in our broadcasts. We have been so fortunate to have some big names from around the world join our show. We had Dr. Jane Monckton Smith from the UK, who has written some fabulous work and has a new book out on domestic violence homicide, where she lays out 8 steps and red flags that people should be able to recognize in the relationship building process. It was really powerful, and we hope people will go back and listen to that. And then we brought on Dr. Judy Ho, who is a forensic neuropsychologist from the Los Angeles area, who just helped us immensely understand, again, this psychopathy of people focusing on the predator side of domestic violence. And then we brought in Dr. Ramani, who, if you've had a chance to listen to any of these, who later then talked to us about the narcissism involved in domestic violence homicide and the relationship process. And so being able to talk with you is just really exciting, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, no, this is a home run. Dave, thank you so much for your time. I have to commend you. That podcast Cold is riveting. And I've spent, I can't tell you how long in the car, or drives, and I'm like, okay, I got to get to the next one. So for our viewers, if you have not heard this yet, make sure you get over there and you listen about the Susan Powell story. So, well, thank you for being here. So let's kind of unpack this. Where do you want to start in terms of, how you got into this whole thing and what kind of, now we need some nuggets, by the way, that's kind of our secret here. So, kind of give us something to chew on out here. So,
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We have plenty of those coming up.
Okay.
I think a good place to start, guys, would be because of your expertise in profiling, right? Talking about why some of these people do the things they do. When I started looking at the Susan Powell case, going through the police records, I was primarily looking as a radio reporter and producer. I was trying to find information that had not been released, but also any sound. I'm always looking for interviews or recordings that, especially if they've never been heard before, never been shared, I want to bring those to light. And there was a reference in the West Valley Police case files about audio journals that Josh Powell had kept for years during a period of time when he was a young man, when he was dating, and then ultimately around the time that he married his wife, Susan. And I just thought those might not be evidence. West Valley Police didn't view them as evidence, so they never really talked about them publicly. But what would they tell us about the mindset of Josh Powell? And so what you hear in the podcast is, of course, this evolution of the narcissism of Josh Powell, which for you with your expertise, I imagine it's something that you'd be familiar with. But I think most of us in the public, we never really have that kind of experience to listen to that person who can go on and carry out such heinous acts, really describe what's going on in their own minds.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. The ego of these people will not allow them to not leave breadcrumbs along the way. So going back and listening to those, you can start to piece together things that tell you more about his personality, the characteristics, the way in which he pulls this off. It can tell you so much. And the fact that you have that and we're able to listen to it and then use that as part of building your story around it makes this such a deep, not deep, such a powerful message that you've got to deliver in telling the story.
And I think when you mix that with the record that we have from Susan, so Susan, we don't have as many recordings of her, but we have. Thanks to the work of the investigators who served search warrants and subpoenas on her, Facebook, her email, things like that. And also Susan's own personal journals, you see both sides of this relationship. And so I was able to here's Josh's account of, his relationship and what he is saying about Susan. And then on the flip side, here's what Susan's saying about him. And why do these two stories sometimes not match up? And you begin to see the worldview of Josh Powell, the way he perceives his relationships with other people, the way in his own mind, he is the ultimate authority on everything. Everyone else is kind of stupid. When Josh gets fired from a job, it's always somebody else's fault.
Yeah.
And then you have Susan talking about, my husband, he really tries. And you're thinking, okay, two different realities for these people.
Yeah.
How much is, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No, that's all right, Mike. Go ahead.
How much of that is nurturing on Susan's part of trying to many times it's the vision of what our spouse believes we can be that helps us become something better. And so you look at that with her, and yet you think about this narcissistic personality that does exactly what you're talking about. Everybody's at fault. The world's against me. I never get a good break. All of those things coming together and clashing. But as you looked at Susan's messaging, at what point does she start to realize I've got a real problem on my hands here?
Susan's recognition of her situation, I think, kind of comes at her sideways. It's very clear that Josh and Susan's relationship was not, all roses from the beginning. They struggled, they argued a lot, and I think that's probably very relatable. Many of us in relationships, you meet somebody, you become involved, you don't know their full family history, you don't know, all the warts that we all hide. And so there's this period for a year or two where Josh and Susan struggle, but then it's an event that happened that I think just blew Susan away, and that was Josh's father, Steve Powell, made a pass at her. He actually, while she was riding in his minivan one day, getting a ride back to her own parents' house, had this conversation where Steve Powell told Susan, "I'm in love with you. I know you and Josh are thinking of, taking a job, moving away. I just can't bear that. I think you have feelings for me," which is completely untrue. Susan has no feelings for her father-in-law. And in fact, Steve Powell, because he is a voyeur, is surreptitiously recording this conversation. And the police later on in the investigation after Susan disappears find a copy of this recording. And there again, this recording had never been acknowledged or released, but there were references to it in Steve Powell's journals and in some police reports. And so I made it a priority to dig that out because I wanted to hear Susan in her own voice tell us what she really thought about this. Because after she disappeared, Josh and Steve Powell both tried to suggest Susan, she kind of had a thing with my dad, and she was promiscuous and adventurous, and it just did not jibe with what anybody else ever said about Susan. So let's go back, let's check the tape and hear Susan tell us what she really thinks. That event was the impetus for Josh and Susan Powell leaving Washington State, coming to Utah. And then it really is downhill from there. Within a year or two, Josh and Susan are just bickering all the time. Josh can't hold a job. He's expecting Susan to work full time, take care of the kids, give her paycheck over to him because as the man of the house, he gets to decide how much they spend on groceries or anything else. He isolates Susan from friends and family. He takes away her access to the family's vehicle, requires her to ride a bike to work along a busy highway, and also starts taking steps we see now, looking back, preparing for the day that she would be gone from his life. That's, getting her to sign over power of attorney, taking out $1 million life insurance policy in her name, establishing a trust that says, if anything happens to, myself or Susan, all that money comes to me.
That's interesting. I think one of the things that jumps out immediately, Dave, is the fact that you right away, you got right into the well where all the oil was, right? For lack of a better description. And from a investigative behavioral analysis side, we start seeing a lot of these dynamics. Mike and I talk about, the three types of lives that we live, right? Our public, private, and our secret life. Okay. And the dynamics that you're talking about there are all encompassed in that secret life, play, right? But the most important and one of the most interesting things that you've raised here is the fact that the insecurities that Josh started to exhibit with Susan, okay, was a direct result as a triggering event from the father who was making the hit on the daughter or the daughter-in-law, right? Did you find that was an interesting correlation that behavior started to shift pretty rapidly into this isolation?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've had the opportunity to speak at some length with a psychologist about this. Josh, as a young man, it's pretty likely that this narcissistic personality identity that he was developing had not yet kind of fully solidified. Mm-hmm. And Steve Powell clearly had some very aberrant behavioral problems in the sense that he would film random women from the back of his minivan with its tinted windows from the mall parking lot, doing things that were, if not criminal, definitely concerning. And Josh Powell, I think, always was in a tug of war with his father over who was going to be in control of their relationship.
There you go.
Steve was so overbearing that actually, as a teenager, you see Josh rebel against his dad by becoming devoutly religious. Steve is very anti-religion, especially Latter-day Saint philosophy. And so what does Josh do to express his independence? He becomes the ultimate Mormon. And ultimately, he ends up meeting Susan this way. He is going to the singles ward and socializing. But as soon as he has Susan on the hook, the religion thing goes away.
Yeah.
And I think you see this, happen for years and years afterward, where Josh is always in his father's shadow until, and especially, when Steve makes this pass at Susan, it's like, well, Dad, you've now tarnished this thing that I own. And so we're going to take it and leave. But I think he always looked at Susan as lesser than after that happened.
I don't want to lose this piece of the discussion, Dave. Go back to when you were able to track down Susan's comments about Steve making this pass on her. What did she say about that? Let's make it really clear to the listeners the level of contempt that she had after that occurred.
Disgust. I mean, what you hear in this recording is Susan trapped in a vehicle going, probably 65 miles an hour down the highway with a man who is her husband's father, who she is not interested in any way, telling her that he has a physical, sexual, romantic interest in her. It makes me cringe just listening to it. You hear her say specifically, "I'm just the daughter-in-law. That's all I want to be. I'm sorry you think this or feel this way. It was never my intention to give you any indication that I was interested in you." But I think at the same time, she's a young woman. This is a very awkward situation. And to be perfectly frank, it's a dangerous situation.
She had to have been terrified, actually, being in that trapped environment. How quickly did she tell Josh what had happened, or did she ever tell him?
Interestingly enough, in the recording, Steve asks Susan, "Are you going to talk to Josh about this?" And Susan says, "There's nothing that I don't talk to Josh about." She tells him immediately. But what we see happen is now Josh is stuck in the middle. He has his wife on one side saying, "Your dad made this pass at me." And he has his dad on the other side saying, "She's making it up. She was coming on to me." And Josh has to make a choice. Who does he believe?
That's called triangulation.
Yeah.
And who does he believe?
Oh, he believes his father. Yeah. And
imagine the message that sends to this woman.
Yeah. And so I think Susan, from that point going forward, she knew very clearly that she was in a really bad spot. And, unfortunately, there are other factors at play in the sense of, Josh and Susan have under their religion, they have an eternal marriage. They have been sealed in a temple. They believe that they will be together in the afterlife. And the disillusion of that kind of a relationship is, for Susan, a huge, huge thing.
Yeah. So let's unpack some of that, and not where she's at mentally yet. Let's stay with Dad and with our bad guy here, right? So it's kind of like if you picture a bus coming at you and you see a destination, right? There's this window that says, "Oh yeah, there's an eternal concept here." Okay. One of the biggest problems, though, that people make is they forget that there's another bus right on schedule if that one leaves. Okay. And then they forget to lift up the baggage compartment and see what's inside of that baggage compartment before getting on the ride. Okay. So a lot of times the secret life is in that baggage compartment. So I'm interested in some of the behaviors of dad. If you could kind of set the plate for us on what dad was going through that got him the confidence enough to sit with his daughter-in-law and actually manipulate that situation. Can you help us understand that a little bit deeper, Dave?
Absolutely. Steve Powell, we talked about him a lot in the Cold podcast, but there is a lot more to his story that didn't even fit that maybe we can go into a little bit here. Steve grew up in a very troubled family. He talked about his parents when he was growing up would play what they called the kidnapping game. One parent or the other in the middle of a fight would take the kids and they'd disappear, go across the country and be gone for 3 or 6 months at a time.
Interesting.
And the other parent would have to basically hunt down the spouse and the children and then haul them back. And then the opposite would happen. The other parent would take off with the kids. Steve wrote about witnessing the very gruesome suicide of one of his mother's. I don't want to speak wrong here, but one of her romantic partners.
Okay.
And he wrote himself about having what he believed was something of an arrested development as far as Oedipal considerations, that he never detached himself from certain thoughts, almost sexualized thoughts about his own mother. Steve Powell, when he gets married to his wife, Terry, they're married. They're living up in Spokane. He is a regular church-going Joe who sings in the ward choir. He becomes infatuated with another woman in their neighborhood who is also singing in the choir, and he begins writing prolific journals about this woman, his fantasies of being with her. And this woman has no idea that Steve Powell is thinking of her this way. And ultimately, Steve Powell's wife, Terry, finds these journals, confronts her husband saying, my gosh, what are you doing? You're talking about wanting to have a polygamist relationship with this woman. You've got to stop this. And she forces Steve Powell to burn these secret sexualized journals of his.
Interesting.
Then we see Steve and Terry Powell split up. Josh is 16 years old.
Did he do it? Did he do it? Did he burn them?
Yes, he did, as far as we're aware.
Okay.
Because Steve later writes that he's heartbroken over this because he wished he wouldn't have done it.
Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt.
He was caught and trying to get out of it is the only reason he burned them.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think what we see happen is this goes underground for a little while with Steve Powell. He finds himself a single man. He starts going to the gym. He's taking Zumba classes so that he can ogle the women in these dance classes. And when Josh, his oldest son, brings Susan home, this is his new obsession. And so he latches on to her. At that point, he is surreptitiously filming her. Josh and Susan actually live with Steve Powell for a while. And it's like, the voyeur's dream. He is sliding mirrors under the bathroom door. He's hiding outside his own house, filming back into his home through the windows, trying to, upskirt Susan and things like this. At the same time, he's now writing journals again, and he spends the next 10 years pouring out thousands of pages all about Susan. And as awful as those journals are, they actually provide a very well documented account of the dissolution of Josh and Susan's relationship, because Steve Powell is always hoping that he can wedge his way in, push Josh out of the picture, and then take over in that relationship.
Hey, Dave, this is a little odd, but could we kind of step back prior to the marriage with Susan and tell us what you learned about Steve and Josh's relationship and the controlling, the manipulation, the lessons learned that Josh gets along the way? Because this becomes very important from a profiling perspective.
Yeah. Thanks to Steve Powell's divorce, there were a flurry of accusations that went back and forth in the divorce, and so we capture a lot of information about Josh's childhood that I think he later was really frustrated became public. Josh was one of these kids who, growing up, his dad is telling him things like humans are just animals and animals should be able to have sex with other animals anytime they want. You as a man should be able to have sex with any woman that you want. There are accusations that Steve Powell is exposing his daughters to pornography at a very young age, sliding it into a girl's backpack or under the pillow on the bed. And on the flip side, Josh has his mother, who is very religious, who's trying to instill some values in her son and establish some rules. And Steve is constantly telling Josh, you don't have to follow your mom's rules. You can do whatever you want. Josh, at one point as a young man, attempts to take his own life. He is caught in the middle of trying to hang himself. He is said to have chased his mother around the kitchen with a knife, threatening her at one time. He took his younger sister's pet gerbils out of their
cages.
And threw them against the wall, and then made her handle the corpses of these poor pets afterward. There was even an accusation that Josh and one of his brothers had cornered a little girl at a swimming pool one time and were attempting to unclothe this other child. So there were a lot of behaviors that Josh was exhibiting that I think from a psychological standpoint, you might say appear to show acting out, evidence of having acted out as a result of what he was experiencing from his father.
Interesting.
So, and I want to follow a line here, Chris, if you're okay.
Yep.
So with that in mind, Dave, now we move forward to Josh and Susan moved to Salt Lake City, and the relationship is deteriorating rapidly, but we're seeing now control mechanisms come into play. And how many of those were control mechanisms that you think he learned at the hands of his father and his own troubled life, but it's so consistent with other domestic violence cases where we see the isolation occurring. The victim is ultimately removed from the very support system that they should have, so they can't reach out and ask for help. And you talked about the vehicle being taken away, and of course the finances are taken away. And people are pretty judgmental at times about, well, why doesn't this individual just simply leave? Well, when all of those control mechanisms are in place and functioning, it's really difficult to leave without becoming very public in leaving. So maybe you could just kind of chat about that for a moment.
Absolutely. A couple really important points there. One, certainly Josh watched his parents when they went through the divorce. Steve Powell was constantly working the court. One thing that Steve Powell had was a charisma, and he knew how to talk to a judge, how to talk to a social worker, how to really gaslight, his wife, ex-wife, and to really brainwash his kids into, look at all the horrible things that other people are doing to me. I'm your dad. I'm the one who loves you. Josh, though, I think really figured a lot of these behaviors out on his own. And the reason I say that is because going through a large trove of Josh's personal computer files that I was able to get a hold of, I started finding references to this woman, Catherine, who Josh had dated prior to his meeting and marrying Susan. And Catherine had never been identified. She'd never been interviewed. Police weren't aware of her. I managed to find her, track her down, talk to her. And what she described was a 6-month relationship with Josh Powell. She had moved in with him, very similar to what we see happen with Susan a couple of years later. But Catherine, recognizing that the walls were closing around her, that Josh was beginning to cut her off in these ways, she took a trip with a friend out of state. And then once she was safely out of state, she called him and said, "I'm not coming back." And so he had no opportunity to really at that point, grab her. But I think what we see happen is Josh learned from that experience. And when he then went on to meet Susan and really woo Susan, presenting himself as, her dream guy, he's religious, he's got a job, he's got his own apartment, which to a 19-year-old girl seems like a big deal. He, within 6 months of meeting her, has put a ring on her finger and committed her to the relationship. And so he was not going to let her walk away. And then because of the narcissism and the way he views her as property, from that point, I think going forward, it was about protecting what was his. And so those behaviors increase over time as she begins to exert her independence, as she recognizes that she is not happy having a husband that dictates her life to her this way. And she starts to tell him, "You know what? I'm going out with my girlfriends and I'm taking the car and you're going to stay home and watch the kids." And that's that. Right. A guy like Josh does not like that. And I think what we see happen is he begins, as I said before, laying the groundwork, recognizing Susan is no longer somebody I can control. Therefore, I have to make sure she can't take off.
Yeah, interesting. So to dovetail into what lane Mike was going down in there. So we've got the dad setting the plate for narcissistic personality traits as well as sexual deviance. So you've got him kind of setting the plate there. You've got mom who's kind of in the way, for lack of a better term, because she's probably subservient to her husband at that, by this point, if he's having all these other behaviors taking place, and the fact that he's writing it down so eloquently, right? So his fantasy set, right, Mike? I mean, this guy's 2-3 miles down the road. What I find is an interesting correlation, though, pretty quickly, is the fact that Josh, obviously his insecurities have caused him to become excessively possessive pretty quickly. Not necessarily over a period of time, but it sounds like, he wants to grab what he can get and hold on to it for as long as he can. Is there a correlation between the kidnap game and her disappearance, in your opinion?
That's tough for me to say. I don't know how aware Josh was of some of his own father's backstory. Clearly, he would be aware of the fact that his grandparents had not had, the quote unquote ideal relationship. Josh, though, my personal opinion, I don't think he did what he ended up doing to Susan in a very emotional way. Whereas I think the kidnap game was very much about twisting the knife for the other partner. Josh, I personally believe, viewed Susan and what she brought to the relationship in a almost dispassionate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. What were you going to say? I could see your mind.
Well, no, I think that's really spot on with this idea that he starts to disassociate with her, and that mom and dad and the experience they were having was to punish the other parent as much as anything else. It wasn't to rescue or save children. It doesn't sound like. So that's really interesting. Now, just in the interest of time, and we want people to go back and listen starting at the very first podcast in the Cold series, Dave. But let's step forward to the day Susan disappears and just kind of give us a high level view of the story and the significant things, because man, there's so much that goes beyond this story and the day of her disappearance. But maybe you could just kind of fast forward us to that point.
Absolutely. So December 6th of 2009, it's a Sunday. Susan is going to church with, her kids. She comes home around noontime. Josh, at this point of his life, he is not interested in taking part in religion. He did not go to church with her. He offers to make kind of a late lunch for Susan and a neighbor friend who is coming over to help Susan with a knitting project. And so he makes some pancakes, feeds them individually to Susan and this neighbor friend on their own paper plates, cleans up the kitchen, which is outside the norm. This is not something Josh normally does.
What a great husband.
Yeah.
Isn't that perfect for in front of the neighbor?
And, tucks, even the neighbor tucks the blanket up over Susan. Oh, you look cold. Susan, at some point after that, begins to feel tired. She excuses herself to go lay down in the bedroom. The friend is still there working on the knitting project. Meantime, Josh is kind of trying to shoo her out the door. And he says he wants to take his kids out sledding. So the neighbor leaves. Josh leaves with his boys, and Susan is never seen or heard from again. What ends up happening is a big snowstorm rolls in that night. The following morning, Josh and Susan's kids are always supposed to be at daycare, at the same time, because both parents are working at this point. They don't show up. The daycare provider goes over to the house. There are no tire tracks in or out of this fresh snow in the driveway. The front door to the house is locked. Nobody's answering phones. So the daycare provider calls the emergency contact, which is Josh's older sister, who also lives in Utah. Josh's sister and mother, who lives with this sister, come to the house. They ultimately grant police access to break a window to go into the house, fearing that maybe the family's inside, overcome by carbon monoxide. And when the police get in there, nobody's in the house. The family's minivan is missing. No indication of a struggle, but there are 2 box fans that are on in the living room, pointed at the foot of the couch. Later that afternoon, Josh Powell returns, says that he has no idea where Susan is. He had taken his boys out for a camping trip to make s'mores sometime between 12:30 and 1 a.m. the night before. Oops, I forgot that it was Sunday night, not Saturday night. Oops, I missed work. Shoot. Oh, well, what are you going to do? And the detective who has been called out to look for Susan at this point tells Josh, all right, you got to come down to the substation. We're going to have a conversation. They do an interview where Josh is clearly evasive. He's using his kids as distraction. But the story that he tells is, I think Susan would have gone to work. I don't know why she wouldn't have gone to work. She was fine with it. I brought the kids back from sledding. We watched a movie. At 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, she asked me to clean the couch. So I used the rug doctor to clean the couch. That's why those fans were there. Normal. And unfortunately, what happens from this point is the West Valley City Police team, looking at what they have, they feel like they don't have enough probable cause to detain Josh or to get a search warrant for his house. So they tell Josh, come back tomorrow morning. We're going to do a follow-up interview. We still have some more questions.
Hang on for a minute.
Yeah.
Hang on. Did anybody test the pancake batter?
So what ends up happening is the following day, Josh goes in for this interview, and that's when these search warrants are served. So the West Valley Police go to the house. The house has been cleaned up, and they search. I'll get to it. One sec, Chris. They search his minivan, and in his minivan they find 2 trash bags. One of the trash bags was all of the refuse out of the kitchen garbage, and they find the remains of the pancake lunch, and that is forensically tested, and they find nothing.
Okay.
And I wondered about that, Chris, and I thought more likely something in an individual drink rather than pancake, because that would have tipped over the neighbor too, put her to sleep.
Well, not necessarily. He could have two batches going here.
Well,
And
good point.
what a perfect cover. What a perfect play. Yeah, I fed the neighbor. She's fine. But my wife all of a sudden starts getting delirious and she has to go lay down. Okay. So, and maybe he's cleaning up, the neighbor's plates. That'd be interesting, just kind of throwing that up there. But go ahead, finish your where you were headed, Dave.
Yeah. So the other bag that is discovered in Josh Powell's minivan contains several sheets of drywall, sheetrock, that have been severely burned, along with a metal object that had been melted that police couldn't identify. It was so badly damaged by heat that they even sent it to the FBI lab in Quantico for a metallurgical breakdown. All the FBI could say was, whatever this thing was, it was steel, strontium, and calcium, and we don't know what to tell you.
Where'd the drywall come from? Oh,
so the theory is Josh Powell, after he returned home that night and the police said, come back the next morning, 2 weeks before his wife disappeared, he had gone out and purchased an oxyacetylene cutting torch. He had that in the garage, and he appeared to have put these pieces of sheetrock down on the floor of the garage to protect it. And then whatever this object was that you can see here in the police evidence photo, he put that on top of the sheetrock, doused it with gasoline, lit it on fire, and then took his torch and melted it into oblivion.
So this is some type of metal of some sort.
Right. It's been described to me, it would fit in the palm of your hand. It's got some heft. It's heavy. And you could see there were 3 strands of copper wire that were also found with it. When I started talking to the detective about this at the time, and I looked at the paperwork, the police thought maybe it was a cell phone, or maybe it was a GPS unit or a hard drive. And to my eyes, I thought it's none of those things, because a cell phone or a GPS unit, those are mostly plastic. They're just going to burn away to almost nothing. A hard drive, it's not steel. It's aluminum or ceramic for the platters. This was something much more dense, much heavier. And I actually came up with a theory that I talk about in the podcast, that I believe it was probably a power tool. And just recently, I put out a video explaining a theory that I actually specifically believe it was a Rigid brand impact driver. And I go in on this video and talk a little bit about why. The fun part about that was I was able to get one of these tools and actually destroy it myself to try to compare.
What was your analysis?
Well, let's take a look at this video and you can tell me what you think.
That's what I was going to ask.
So I had a friend of mine who has an oxyacetylene cutting torch basically replicate the experiment. We set up the sheetrock panels. We melted this thing for probably 45 minutes to an hour. And you can see it didn't take a lot to really start to make it look like some unrecognizable hunk of metal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if there were any kind of body fluids or anything on that thing, that exercise would have destroyed all evidence. That's for sure.
And you guys tell me what you think. My read of the situation is Josh Powell, once he gets access to his home again, what is his top priority? What is he most concerned about? Why is he going to spend the better part of 2 hours melting something made of metal when he has so many other possible exposures? To me, it suggests murder weapon.
That's really insightful, Dave.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. I think the fact that he has all of these other things in his van. He's got the drywall, he's got this thing, he's got obviously the metal parts, but one of the big problems that he has in the very initial stages after if he has killed her that day or the day of, right, or the day before, is time. And the fact that he's got to go get a blowtorch to burn the murder weapon versus
didn't you say he had that a couple of weeks earlier?
Yeah, he bought it before, right?
Yeah.
They have a receipt of him doing that, or they got him on video? Yeah, so they got him by receipt, making the purchase at your local hardware store, I'm sure of it. But anyway, the fact, though, that he's got this item and now he has to expel the energy to burn this thing down, it's pretty interesting. I mean, why not just take it and throw it in your nearest lake? What's the nearest water body to this guy?
You have the Jordan River, which isn't too far. Where Susan worked, there was a big pond right by her work that, assuming he went by her work on his way out on his camping trip, which is a pretty good bet, he could have tossed it in there just as easily.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked hundreds of cases, and I've not ever had one that involved a drill.
Yeah.
Okay, and the fact that an investigator would go into this thing looking for a drill as the murder weapon, okay, and then him thinking ahead of the investigator, kudos to him if that's the case. But there may be something a little bit deeper that you're into here. That might not necessarily be the murder weapon, but it may be a correlation to that weapon at some point. So I'd be interested in exploring that with you a little bit deeper down the line. But as you process it.
So if we were to move forward now, time passes. What level is he participating in the searches and other things? Were there red flags you saw? And then let's move fast forward to the children and the day in which he kills the children and himself. And then, because our time is getting short, kind of tell us what next steps are for Dave Cawley on this case.
Sure. And I apologize. I do tend to be long-winded in my answers.
You're fine. We love you.
Says the guy who did a 20-hour podcast series. Josh Powell basically spent no effort trying to find Susan. And that was one of the things that I think for those of us in the media, we recognized very quickly this was aberrant, right? Josh is dodging reporters left and right. He is not going out and searching. And in fact, the West Valley Police Department, even though they're being very tight-lipped, they're basically saying he's not helping anymore. He lawyered up the day after Susan disappeared, and from that point going forward was never candid about what had happened. Famously, 10 days after this metal object is found in his minivan, he goes back to Washington and he moves in with dear old dad. And from that point going forward, Josh and Steve are living under the same roof with Susan's kids, and they are actively trying to hinder the investigation. They're trying to mold public perceptions of Susan by taking her childhood journals and putting them on national TV, trying to say, look, when she was a teenager, she had a crush on this boy. Therefore, she's obviously, sexualized and promiscuous. This backfires because it provides probable cause for police to go up and search Steve Powell's home, which is where we find Steve's videos, his journals, these tapes, all of this material that really help fill in the backstory ultimately for us. But as a result of what we learn about Steve Powell, the state of Washington says those kids being in Steve Powell's home, that is not a safe situation. And so we're going to take them into protective custody. Josh at this point loses custody of his kids. The court in Washington is trying to balance his parental rights with everything else. They're allowing Josh visitation, but placing requirements. He has to go and go through a parental evaluation with a psychologist. He can't do visitation at dad's house, right? It has to be someplace else. So Josh rents his own house and he stages it as, a good place for the kids. Social worker comes and checks it out, gives an okay. Meantime, police in Utah are watching all of this and they think the kids are away, they're safe, we've got time to work, we're planning on screening this case at some point, in the next 6, 8, 10 months. And then Josh does the unexpected. I think for them at the time, we look back now and it seems all too inevitable what was coming. During a supervised visit at this rented house on Super Bowl Sunday of 2012, he shuts the visitation supervisor out, takes the kids back, attacks them first with a hatchet, and then douses them and himself with gasoline, lights the house on fire. The kids die, he dies, and basically any hope of learning from him what happened to Susan dies as well.
Interesting. You're mute, Mike.
F-35s flying overhead. That poor caseworker pleading on the phone for help. And that whole thing became very ugly in the end. Shortly after that, Steve Powell dies as well. Is that right?
So what we see happen from that point forward is the complete collapse of this family. Josh's brother, Michael, who had really not been somebody the police were looking at before a period of time when they served that search warrant. They also had a wiretap and they started hearing conversations between Josh and Michael that were very concerning. Michael is living in Minneapolis, and a year after Josh kills the boys, Michael takes his own life by jumping off of the parking garage at his condo complex. Steve Powell goes to prison for the voyeurism and child pornography. He was filming neighbor girls through an open bathroom window, the house next door. And he ultimately dies in prison he dies from a heart attack after being released from prison in summer of 2018. It leaves basically Josh's older sister, Jennifer Graves, who had disassociated herself from the family, had tried to help police, was a dear friend of Susan's. Josh's mom, who has never spoken to anybody from the media. And then Josh's younger brother, John, who has bipolar disorder, and his younger sister, Alina, who declined to speak to me for the podcast.
What would be really interesting, Dave, if we actually try to connect some of these dots of pre and post incident behavioral ideas. And you mentioned a very key word in staging. What would be interesting is see if the stuff in the van isn't part of that play. Because if you think about what you just said, he got this house in another state, right? And this was all a staged play for a perception of stability, okay? And if you take that a little bit further, something in that staging process melted down, which created this rage. And that rage subsequently turned into homicidal behavior, okay? So that is the same rage that Susan experienced, okay? So what would be interesting is to take these into two blocks, the second post-incident and the first pre-incident. What were the staging behaviors that you recognize through your research? And by the way, I think your podcast is just phenomenal. I if anybody has not heard this, again, go listen. It's just fantastic. But it would be interesting though to take both of those pieces and see if they cross mesh and correlate into each other. You may have already done that. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll share a couple observations. One, I think Josh had the idea of disappearing Susan at least 2 years before he actually did it. Okay. And I think what we see happen in the steps that he took is an escalation, and the plan probably evolved over time. most important to Josh was, how do I get the money? How do I make sure that the money comes to me? I don't think the means of actually carrying out her death were incredibly well thought out on his part. But, when we were talking about the pancake before, the question becomes, well, what did he put? If he put something in the pancake or in a drink, what did he put? Well, I was able to discover and timeline out that 3 months before Susan disappeared, Josh had been involved in a suspicious rear-end car crash. He had used that car crash to obtain a prescription for a drug called cyclobenzaprine, which is a muscle relaxant, which if you talk to somebody, they say it won't poison you, but it will definitely take you off your feet. When police served the search warrant on the house, they recovered the cyclobenzaprine. Even though Josh was in such pain from this crash, there are only a handful of pills missing from the bottle. So he's not using this himself. The day, there's a pivotal day in this story where Susan goes to the temple to pray about her marriage because she's thinking about divorcing Josh. And this is a year before she disappears. She ultimately decides she needs to stay with Josh. In reviewing digital evidence from the case, I actually found a file that Josh created on his laptop computer that very same day called Persons in the News. And it was just a mention of two names, Alicia Seide and Kaylee Anthony, both of whom at the time were missing people who were suspected of having been killed, but had not yet been confirmed to have been murdered. So Josh is sitting at home. He knows his wife is out. They've argued. He knows she's thinking about divorce, and he's spinning thinking, okay, these people have been disappeared. How do I do it? And how do I do it better? The day that Susan disappeared, where he screwed up, was he came back from his camping trip, drove all the way to West Valley, and then took a phone call from a neighbor, and his phone pinged in West Valley. He realized police were at his house, and he then backtracked and drove all the way down to Point of the Mountain. So for people not familiar, that's about a 40-minute drive, south of his house, to call Susan's phone and leave her a voicemail saying, hey, I hope you had a good day at work. I'm coming to pick you up. But of course, Josh had her cell phone in the minivan with him, which is a fact that he later gets tripped up on. So he made a lot of rookie mistakes in this execution of the plan.
Interesting.
When you go to 2012 and Josh now is making the plan to kill the children, I think he conceives of it and executes it in a very short time frame. And he's learned from what had happened before. And so rather than sit and dwell on this for years and years and years, he, in the space of 2 or 3 months, has basically set up what is, in his mind, going to work, his plan to get his kids back. When that fails, he already has this built-in fallback, and it's just simple execution. That's my take of kind of A versus B, if you will.
That's amazing. And yes, it does appear that there is a lot of pre-planning with the changes in the life insurance policies and the beneficiaries. The fact that he gets a house and stages that in a way that it makes it possible for him to get the kids, and then immediately puts his plan into play. This is an incredibly complex case, Dave. Just in the last minute we have, what's next for you?
We've basically exhausted at this point all of the leads that I have for the Powell case. There's one piece that's still outstanding, and that is this encrypted hard drive that Josh had that has never been cracked. I know some people that are still working on that. Hopefully one day we'll learn more. In the meantime, I'm going full throttle on a season 2 of Cold. We're going to be talking about another case involving, sadly, violence against women, and also trying to highlight again some of these red flag behaviors and continue the conversation around domestic violence and protecting victims.
Hey, there's I don't know if they're still in the game or not, but Purdue University has an incredible white collar crime in relationship to breaking those types of problems. So if you get an opportunity, look up Purdue University, see if they still have in their criminology, they have a whole section of students that have been studying this stuff for at least 15, 20 years now. And they're really good at cracking open some eggs, and a lot of LA has utilized them. So maybe that's an opportunity to break into that hard drive.
Thank you for the tip. Yeah, every little bit's going to help.
Never know.
Yeah,
never know.
Well, wow, what a great hour! It's flown by. To Dave Cawley of KSL Radio Television, thank you so much for your efforts in keeping Susan Powell in the public spotlight and continuing to bird dog that case. And to my good friend Chris, thanks so much for joining. Folks, if you ever feel intimidated or unsure of your surroundings and you're feeling unsafe at home, or you know somebody who's feeling that way, get out immediately and get to your local law enforcement agency, your mental health provider, or your medical provider and get help. These things do not get better. And so until we talk again, we wish you all the very best. Thanks and have a good day.
Don't forget to subscribe.